We haven't been tapping into new areas of the brain. We've just been awakening the most ancient. This technology is simply a route to powers that conjurers and alchemists used centuries ago. Human race lost that knowledge, and now I'm reclaiming it through virtual reality.
Angelo's like all brilliant types, erratic. But we tolerate them here at the shop as long as they perform. And Angelo has certainly done that. Project 5 is very impressive.
The potentials for human advancement are endless. Virtual reality holds a key to the evolution of the human mind, and that's my focus.
I'm going through a lot of changes right now.
Well, I'm going through a lot of changes, too. You're too obsessed with your work to even notice.
Caroline, this technology is going to change the world. This is the future, and you're afraid of it. I've got to find a way to continue the work on my own. There's so much to do. I can't wait any longer.
Job, do you like to play games?
Yeah. Peter says you have the best games.
Well, I have a game in my house that you might like to play. Would you like that?
Yeah.
Game over.
It's just a game.
That was really bad.
I have other different games. I even have one that could help make you smarter.
I was born dumb.
Correct answer.
Yeah!
The electrochemistry of his brain has responded better than I expected.
I can't believe you went ahead and did this, Larry.
Look at the comparisons. It works with a human subject.
Do I know you?
I mow your lawn.
No.
Yeah?
You're not the Lawnmower Man. Wow.
Dr. Angelo, I think people can tell that I'm changing.
I've gone as far as I can in my lab at home.
Just graduated to the next level, Job.
I need access to the main lab here to go further. There's no telling how far I can take Job.
You're moving too fast. Even with all these new abilities that are dangerous.
You realize, Dr. Angelo, that my intelligence has surpassed yours.
You're trying to get inside my head, Job. I can feel you pushing.
The treatments have to continue.
The Lawnmower Man arrived on the big screen on the 6th of March in 1992 in the United States and made its way to the UK on the 5th of June. It was directed by Brett Leonard on a budget of $10 million, and it would go on to make $32 million in the USA alone, making it New Line Cinema's most successful film of 1992. The reviews for The Lawnmower Man were generally mixed, though many praised the visual effects and its most talked about moment featuring cyber sex. The Daily Breeze newspaper awarded it 2.5 stars, saying, "Science fiction enthusiasts will find a lot to chew on, particularly concerning virtual reality, a field that exists in a slightly less advanced form than portrayed in the film. Everyone else can watch the pretty lights. There's a lot more effort and thought in The Lawnmower Man than in most Stephen King films." The Daily Times gave it 7 out of 10. The critic Michael Price was impressed with the performances from Pierce Brosnan and Jeff Fahey, comparing it to the movie Tron and its striking imagery. He mentions The Lawnmower Man gave us a window into the development of the next step in technology with virtual reality. Critic Kim Newman awarded it 3 out of 5 for Empire magazine, saying since most of the first half of the film introduces extraneous characters against whom Job has a grudge, it's a fair bet that before you can say Carrie or Christine, the augmented Job will be killing them off in a bizarre, often in lawnmower-oriented ways. This works surprisingly well, with interesting and well-integrated visual effects, some nice humour, and a few genuinely visionary touches. The trouble is that it has to boil itself down ridiculously for a finale, in which Lona Brosnan sprouts an instant family just so he can have someone to hug after the laboratory has blown up. Nevertheless, well worth a look. Roger Ebert and Gene Siskel didn't give the film a proper review on TV or in the newspaper, but Gene Siskel did give it a little write-up awarding it 2 stars, saying, "A widely overwrought sci-fi drama, and the only reason to see this picture is some of the computer graphics." Once it hit home video, it gained a larger audience, and New Line Cinema released a director's cut on VHS and Laserdisc with 40 minutes of new footage. This further boosted sales and encouraged other studios to put out director's cuts. In 1997, New Line would put out a special edition release on Laserdisc featuring a new THX-approved transfer of the director's cut with extra features such as an audio commentary and behind-the-scenes material. A year after the film's release, there would be a bunch of video games across the gaming consoles and home computers, and a sequel in 1996 that will be discussed later in the video. Shortly after the film's theatrical release, New Line Cinema would run into legal troubles with Stephen King, who filed a lawsuit against the studio, claiming the film bore no meaningful resemblance to his short story, aside from the title and a brief 2-minute scene in which the lawnmower attacks and kills the abusive father of Peter, and King insisted that his name be removed from advertisements and from the film's credits. A federal judge ordered the filmmakers to grant his request. However, Allied Vision and New Line felt the judge's ruling was too broad and might force them to remove prints already in circulation and affect the worldwide distribution. They appealed, and a decision was made that New Line cease using King's name in advertising, but did not have to remove a based upon on-screen credit. New Line and King had reached a settlement of $2.5 million. However, New Line continued to use King's name in advertising for the movie, violating their agreement. 2 years later, in 1994, a federal judge found New Line in contempt of court for failure to remove King's name from VHS tapes and posters. The judge gave New Line 30 days to comply or face $10,000 a day penalty. They eventually would remove King's connection, in some cases slapping stickers over King's name on the VHS tapes. The 1997 release of the film on Laserdisc removed his credit on the sleeve, but still had his credit in the film, though the voiceover using his name in the trailer was clumsily cut out. I think once it hit DVD, it would remove his name entirely from everything. The Lawnmower Man originated as a short story by Stephen King in 1975, which focuses around Harold Parkett, who hires a gardener to cut his lawn. Parkett later spies on the fat serviceman, discovering his lawnmower mows the lawn by itself, while he crawls after it naked, eating the grass. The serviceman worships the Greek god Pan. When Parkett tries to call the police, the mower and its owner ritually kill him as a sacrifice to the Greek god. The story would later be included in a collection called Night Shift in 1978 and later adapted into a comic in 1981. The film adaptation rights to the Lawnmower Man short story was purchased by producer Milton Subotsky, the co-founder of Amicus Productions, in 1978, shortly after the story was republished, and plans for any movie ended up in development hell for a number of years. Amicus Productions had produced a bunch of horror anthologies. They had done the original Tales from the Crypt and Vault of Horror in the early 70s. Milton had actually left Amicus in 1975. He decided to go off and create 2 new production companies. He had purchased the rights to 6 different short stories by Stephen King, and that included The Lawnmower Man. And he was going to do 2 different anthology films, with one focusing on fantasy and the other science fiction and horror. The Lawnmower Man was going to be part of an anthology film called The Machines, which never got made, and then the rights would eventually be sold off in 1990 to Allied Vision. Bob Pringle and Steve Lane of Allied Vision were looking for a director to bring The Lawnmower Man to the big screen, and stumbled across a horror film called The Dead Pit by director Brett Leonard. It was Brett's first feature, made for a small budget, shot on 35mm film, and it managed to gain a decent amount of interest for it to make a profit, and they approached Brett with Stephen King's short story. Brett read it and had his reservations. He felt he couldn't take this short story and turn it into an 80-minute or so B-movie. The producer's ideas were initially about a serial killer that rounded up women for fertilizer. This was not the kind of film Brett wanted to make. Brett had already developed a script called Cybergod based on ideas of virtual reality, which came about due to his involvement with the tech community in Santa Cruz. Brett had been living in Santa Cruz, California, and he was suddenly thrust into this community of people like Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and a man named Jaron Lanier. Thanks to Jaron, Brett was taken to an event called Cyberthon in 1990, which was a 24-hour event in San Francisco, where you went and experienced all these cyber innovations, and he experienced a very early version of virtual reality. Brett instantly saw its possibilities and thought if he could extrapolate that in a cinematic sense, it could be a tremendously interesting subject matter, and this is where he wanted to go with his next film. But he had a problem. The producers wanted a serial killer film, and yet Brett wanted to make a science fiction film. So Brett and his writing partner Jamil Everett would take their Cybergod script and incorporate the Lawnmower Man. Taking inspiration from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, their idea was to have an experiment that combines the physical world and one made up of pure energy, and how those 2 worlds overlap, and the actual Lawnmower Man, called Job, goes from being a human existing in the physical world to entering the computer world as pure energy, but they made sure it included elements of the King short story. The good news is that the producers, especially Bob Pringle, liked Brett's idea, but they had some stipulations, saying, "We've got to make some horrifying experiences in this film so that it can be marketed both as a science fiction and a horror film." Allied Vision had begun talks with Paramount Pictures to distribute the film in the USA. Paramount were very keen to cast Jeff Fahey as Job, because they had just done a film with him called Body Parts. Brett saw his work and thought, this guy is potentially a movie star, and also he's a great actor. Jeff read the script and couldn't quite grasp the idea of virtual reality, and wasn't even familiar with video games, but once Brett explained the story and its quasi-religious themes and how Job becomes this superhuman, Jeff was happy to sign on. For the other cast members, we have Pierce Brosnan as Dr. Lawrence Angelo. Pierce had appeared in a number of films already, such as Nomads, The Fourth Protocol, and we can't forget Taffin.
What goes on in this town is none of your business.
As long as I'm living here, it is.
Then maybe you shouldn't be living here!
But Pierce was struggling to find much success and didn't have much work going on in the early 90s, so he jumped onto The Lawnmower Man. Pierce was also going through a difficult time during the shoot, as his first wife Cassandra was battling cancer and would sadly pass away in December of 1991. Brett said Pierce remained professional and didn't let his private life get in the way of his work. Pierce, however, had no interest in the VR technology, saying, "If you understand the character and you know what you're doing, why beat yourself over the head? A job is hard enough without going up to Silicon Valley and spending 3 weeks learning about computers. I don't have a computer, I have no idea how a computer works." But Pierce needed the work and was impressed with Brett Leonard's vision. We have Jenny Wright, who has retired from acting, as Marnie, who falls in love with Job. Brett said we wanted to cast somebody that had a tremendous sexual presence for the character of Marnie, named after the Hitchcock film. Jenny had done a film called Near Dark, and I thought she was just stunning in that film, an incredible actress who kind of reminded me of Greta Garbo, and I thought she gave a great performance. She exudes a kind of an old school movie star quality. The late Jeffrey Lewis plays Terry McKean, the local handyman who employs Job to cut the grass. Jeffrey was a familiar face of TV during the 70s and 80s. He would go on to star in a bunch of popular films such as Night of the Comet, Fletch Lives, Double Impact, and Point of No Return. The late Jeremy Slate plays Father Francis McKean, who is Terry's brother. Francis is an angry Irish priest who takes his anger out on Job, who is in his care. Jeremy had worked on many classic movies such as True Grit, working with John Wayne, and would tell Brett many stories about his experience in the industry. Dean Norris plays the director of The Shop, the shady company seeking work from the military. Dean had a big career on TV and is probably best known for his role in Breaking Bad. Dean appeared in loads of films, often cast as a military guy with Total Recall, T2 and Starship Troopers. Mark Bringleson plays Sebastian, who works closely with Dr. Angelo at VSI. Mark's career as an actor has had its ups and downs, with a small amount of credits in recent years. He had appeared in The Fisher King, Dollman, Airheads, Austin Powers and Soldier. Austin O'Brien plays Peter, a friend of Job and a local neighbour of Dr. Angelo. Peter is struggling with his abusive father and spends time with Angelo to get away. This was Austin's first acting role on the big screen. He will later go on to star in Last Action Hero, My Girl 2 and the dreaded sequel to The Lawnmower Man. Austin said about his experience on set, "Using the VR equipment was like being in a magical toy store, although it could be overwhelming. It's really cool moving in all directions, but you've got to get used to it. The first time I tried it, I had just had breakfast, not a good idea." Rosalie Mayu plays Carla, Peter's mother. Rosalie had bit parts on TV and in more recent years moved into stand-up comedy. Ray Linkins plays Harold, Peter's father, who meets his demise at the hands of Job as he controls the lawnmower with his mind to kill him. Ray has had a small number of acting roles, but his main career is a stunt coordinator and has worked on over 100 movies. John Laughlin plays Jake, the owner of the petrol station, who enjoys bullying Job. John has appeared in dozens of TV shows and films, including big hits such as Footloose and The Rock. And we have Colleen Coffey, who plays Dr. Angelo's wife Caroline, who is getting frustrated with her husband as he has become obsessed with his work. Caroline only has a short part in the theatrical cut, but she has a larger role in the director's version. Colleen has seemed to have retired from acting, but did have bit parts in popular TV shows such as Dallas, Baywatch, NYPD Blue, and Murder, She Wrote. Principal photography began in late May of 1991 in LA with a $10 million budget, and they finished filming in July. Being an independent production, they were operating under the radar, and Brett Leonard needed to find talent to work on a limited budget, and he found cinematographer Russell Carpenter, who had worked on Critters 2 and Death Warrant. He and Russell scouted for locations that had big green lawns, and they couldn't find any that were acceptable except in Pasadena, though some of the lawns had to be painted to maintain that bright green colour to give it that traditional look. For the VSI headquarters and VR lab, Brett wanted something that looked oppressive, with cement walls and pillars like it was from George Orwell's 1984. They found a warehouse near Silicon Beach. It had everything he needed, cement walls and an observation deck that allowed Angelo to observe Job in the VR gear. Production designer Alex McDowell would go about creating all of the VR devices, which included the lab, the suits, and the chair that hangs from the wires. As Brett was in touch with people in the tech industry, he made the process of essentially copying the existing gear and using it in the film. In the case of the VR headsets, they were identical to what Brett saw at the Cyberthon event. The next piece of equipment was the gyrosphere. They thought, how would you move around in VR? And they stumbled across an exercise device by moving your weight. That helps make it turn as you work out your muscles. So the gyrosphere made it a great visual idea on how to represent someone in the VR world. Being inside the gyro and spinning around and being hooked up for a number of hours was difficult and tiring, and being spun for too long would make you very ill, with Jenny Wright struggling with being spun around for a short while. One of the most difficult scenes to film was the only sequence in reference to Stephen King's original story. Brett has the lawnmower chew up the carpet that would be handled by a second unit team with little time left to shoot it. They had a set that was raised above the ground so they could pull the rug away as it gets chewed up. For health and safety reasons, the blades weren't really that sharp, and having Ray, who worked as a stunt coordinator, he didn't need to be doubled. Once Brett had put his rough cut of the film together, they had to sell it to a distributor. Paramount were no longer in the picture, and they screened it to various buyers, and New Line Cinema were impressed, and they decided to come on board and distribute it worldwide. But when they acquired the film, Bob Shea, who ran New Line, came to the editing room and screened the film with the editor and director, with the intent of giving them notes to make changes. Bob said, "Don't cut effects, cut conversation. Character is in the dialogue." Brett said, "We had a lot of character stuff in the movie that was in the director's cut." Bob wanted to see the virtual reality on the screen more and less dialogue, less story setup, get to things a lot faster. Brett said it was brutal in this context because we cut out a huge aspect of the character development of Job and Dr. Angelo in order to get a theatrical release. Brett would later understand that for a theatrical cut of a movie, you can't have it be as long, but it wasn't the full movie he made. The film would be screen tested for the public, and the feedback wasn't great. Many felt it should be a direct-to-video movie. Brett was heartbroken, but he wasn't going to let this feedback get to him, and he spoke with the producers and had some ideas about how to market it. Brett suggested advertising it in 4 markets, with Phoenix, Chicago, LA, and New York, with newspaper ads and a trailer. No TV or media, and see how it does, and it worked in their favour. It had really strong numbers for its opening weekend, so they expanded the press and theatres, but Brett had to force New Line to put the term virtual reality into the marketing of the film. Brett said, "Virtual reality, what the hell is that? I mean, no one knew what the term was all about. I mean, like zero." So it was kind of a stretch, but I think this term's going to become something, and I think we need to reference this, and so I really forced the issue. Shortly after the release of The Lawnmower Man, Brett would meet James Cameron, and James loved the look of the film so much. He took Russell Carpenter and his crew, and even the line producer, to work on True Lies and the rest of his productions, including Avatar. For the film story, we find Dr. Angelo working as a scientist at Virtual Space Industries, known as VSI. He is conducting experiments on monkeys using psychoactive drugs and virtual reality to improve their intelligence, though it has side effects of aggression with a program called Project 5, which is funded by the Shop, a secret organization who provide applications for the military. One of his test subjects, a chimpanzee wearing some sort of a Robocop helmet named Roscoe 1138, a nice reference there to George Lucas's first movie, gains enhanced intelligence and escapes. But the chimp is killed by the laboratory security. Angelo is worried his project will be shut down and looks to move his research to human candidates and recruits his local handyman Job, who has the intelligence of a child and hopes to make him smarter through a series of VR simulations and memory games with the help of his experimental drug. Angelo redesigns the treatments to eliminate the aggression factors used in the chimpanzee experiments. Not only does Job's intelligence improve, but he also develops psychokinesis and telepathy at a rapid pace. Sebastian, the project director, monitors the progress and secretly replaces Angelo's new medications with the original Project 5 formula. Angelo is concerned with Job's speedy progression as he becomes smarter than him. Job attracts the attention of his neighbour and begins a relationship with her. and he invites Marnie to the lab, and he accidentally lobotomizes her. Undeterred, Job continues the treatment on his own and begins killing those who mistreated him in the past, as well as Harold, the abusive father of his young friend Peter. Angelo discovers the drugs have been switched and confronts Job, who ties him up and reveals his plans to achieve the ultimate stage of evolution by transforming into a being of pure energy within the VSI computer mainframe, intending to connect to all the world's computer systems. Job vows that his birth will be signaled by every phone on Earth ringing simultaneously. The shop sends a team to capture Job, but he uses his newfound abilities to destroy them. Job then enters the VSI mainframe, abandoning his physical body and becoming a digital being, and Dr. Angelo has to stop him before it's too late. As mentioned earlier with Brett Leonard's original cut, the director's cut was made available in the 90s and is readily available on Blu-ray. It features the original direction he wanted to go before New Line cut it down. Structurally, it's not very different. It's the same story and played out the same way, but there is a lot added with the setup and more dialogue thrown in. The opening is extended with the chimpanzee escaping from the lab and finding its way to the church and meeting Job, who thinks the chimp is Cybo Man, a comic book character. The chimp would be killed by security from the lab, and this then leads to several other cuts throughout the film to remove callbacks to this plot element, such as the extended conversation at the gas pump. We see Angelo chat with Carla, which shows they have some chemistry. We see Job and Terry at the cafe, and Job wanders off to read the comics and gets hassled by Jake. Another major difference includes moments with Angelo's wife, as Job controls her mind. In the theatrical cut, she just leaves him saying she has booked a flight about 20 minutes into the film, but in the director's cut she says she's going out for drinks with her friends, and later she is killed by the agents as Job controls her mind. Outside of those extended moments, there are several other scenes with extra dialogue, with 40 to 50 seconds here and there, with most of the sequences. With the added 40 minutes of runtime, it certainly adds a lot more meat to the story, with a stronger opening, but it does get bogged down with dialogue, exploring more of the corrupt nature of VSI and Dr. Angelo having his doubts about Job's speedy rise in intelligence, so I can see why New Line wanted to trim it down to get to the fun stuff with the visual effects. I think there could have been a better compromise between the two edits, one that gave a little more story to the beginning and have Angelo's wife remain in the story, as once she leaves in the theatrical cut, he doesn't seem fussed about it, which doesn't really make much sense. By 1992, CGI had already started appearing in big blockbusters, and was seen as the next big step in visual effects, with James Cameron taking advantage of the technology for The Abyss and Terminator 2 to great effect and wowed audiences. But when you are operating on a small budget, you are not going to be able to take advantage of ILM, who are the ones pioneering the effects on the big screen. So Brett Leonard had to look elsewhere to smaller companies who didn't specialise in movies, but had experience doing commercials. The visual effects were covered quite extensively in Cinefex in issue 50. Brett, in an interview for the documentary on the Shout Factory Blu-ray, said, "I utilised my network from Silicon Valley. I found Chaos Systems in San Francisco and Angel Studios in San Diego. Angel was famous for doing the Dynetics commercial featuring an exploding volcano, and they had done some Mexican tire commercials as well. But I saw in these commercials an understanding of form and structure in computer graphics and real talent, convincing them to do it on a very low budget, and they would get promotional value from it. The production ended up with over 20 minutes of computer-generated material, far more than Terminator 2, and their entire production budget was the same as T2's computer graphics costs alone." The film would make use of new visual effects techniques, such as motion capture, as we see it utilised with the priest when he is set on fire. It was handled by an Italian company, who used the technology as a tool for golf training. When Job dispatches the assassins that are sent to Angelo's house, he appears as a giant head, which Brett did as a homage to Zardoz. Job attacks them and breaks them down into data pieces. Chaos Systems were able to write new software that could then take an image and break it down into these component parts and make them into spheres, and then have them spin off into a vortex. At the time, this had never been done before. When Job gets sucked into the computer, they wanted to show that there was nothing left, like his whole body had lost its innards and was absorbed into the system. They deployed a blow-up doll, but the doll was made out of thin material and didn't really work too well. So they purchased a dry suit and sealed all the openings and filled it up with air and shot it and played it back in reverse so it looks like it gets sucked into the computer. But they also needed a head. They didn't have a cast of Jeff Fahey, and due to running out of time they quickly slapped together a papier-mâché head. Pierce runs over and his remains crumble away very quickly, and they try and hide the effect with some optical work, but the end result was pretty poor in execution. Once Job is in the computer world as a cyber being, Angel Studios utilised more than 70 photographs depicting Fahey's vocal and facial gestures to enable CyberJob to accurately lip-sync Fahey's lines. Through the use of a grid pattern drawn on the actor's face, computer wireframe models were established for each gesture to show the character as he appeared in the different cyberspace environments. Physical details, including eyes and teeth, were individually modelled and applied to the refined facial model, along with skin texture taken from a colour photo. The film would deploy some miniatures for the finale as Dr. Angelo escapes with Peter. The exterior of the lab was duplicated in miniature form at David Stipes Productions. A small crew created a 12th scale model which was rigged with pyrotechnics and detonations in the facility's parking lot. As the visual effects were being made digitally, they weren't at a super high resolution because of the storage and memory, and the cost factor of rendering the visual effects in the NTSC video signal. People were concerned about the loss of quality when transferring to film, so these NTSC digital effects were put through a technique called the Gemini process, which was used to transfer CGI onto 35mm film by putting the digital images on a high-resolution CRT screen frame by frame, which were then shot with a motion picture camera. And once on film, there were a few tweaks and enhancements with the grading to hold up to a resolution that was adequate and looked good enough to be projected on a big screen. Now, of course, the VR sequences don't hold up well today and look very dated and silly, and some, to be honest, looked a bit hokey for the time, especially when the swarm of wasps or whatever they are attack the security. When they are playing the VR games, it's perfectly fine. As to the audience, it's sold as a video game. And for 1992, this looked pretty incredible, especially compared to what you had at home with the likes of the Sega Mega Drive or Commodore Amiga, which couldn't achieve these type of graphics. But once Job enters the VR world, this is where it gets a bit wonky with its animation, and it really pushes the limitations. It's unintentionally funny when Job is berating Angelo in the VR world, and once Job can't escape and shouts, "No!" I couldn't help but laugh, as CGI has improved so quickly. Something that seemed really impressive at the time becomes somewhat dated within 6 months, and with its visual style, it didn't do them that many favours to stand up to scrutiny. I, however, applaud them for their work and achievements back in 1992 on a tight budget and pushing the boundaries of what you could do with CGI and the tools available. But for someone who hasn't seen it and not been around to witness this technology evolve from the 90s onwards, will go into this and think it's complete crap. But outside of the VR moments, there are some clever sequences that use computer graphics and hold up quite nicely in an artistic way. So it's not all bad, but if you can accept retro computer graphics, then I'm sure it won't be too much of a problem to sit through. The score to Lawnmower Man was composed by Dan Wyman, and it never got released, so it's really difficult to give the score a proper listen to outside of the end credits and a few flourishes of the score throughout the picture. Dan Wyman had done the score to Brett's first feature film, The Dead Pit. Dan Wyman had been involved with John Carpenter early on in his career on the first Halloween, and Dan joined the Lawnmower Man production very late in the process as Brett was putting a rough cut together. At this stage, the Lawnmower Man was very minimal on sound, so when the score came in, it felt fresh and elevated the picture for Brett. Another bonus for the director was the sound designer Frank Serafini, who had worked on Tron, Star Trek 3 and The Hunt for Red October. Brett said Frank really understood cyber sounds more than almost anyone else in the world to really bring to life the VR sequences. Frank said, "I used a lot of shortwave radio sounds for the brain simulation sequences. By recording all of the off frequencies, we captured people talking on all of the different bands. So on the screen it sounded like people speaking in this virtual reality." Wyman's score unfortunately doesn't do much for the picture. It doesn't leave a lasting impression, and often feels like placeholder music intended to be replaced with something else. Due to the nature of the film, it makes sense to go with an electronic score. A composer like Brad Fidel would have suited the picture perfectly. With Wyman's history, I'm surprised he churned out a score that didn't do much for the action or VR sequences. He only seems to provide music for the more emotional moments, which are okay, but for most of the picture, the music doesn't seem to be deployed, resulting in some scenes falling flat without a musical punch that is sorely missing. It also doesn't help that his score sounds so poorly mixed. As it made perfect sense to adapt the movie into a video game, The Lawnmower Man would arrive on a Super Nintendo, Sega Mega Drive, Mega CD, Game Boy and PC. The SNES game was published by THQ and developed by Simon Pick for the sales curve. On Simon's website he mentions it was the last game he wrote in assembly code, and the game ended up being too hard to play due to last-minute disasters. Simon, during the 1980s, had done ports and arcade conversions to various home computers, and would later work on Die Hard Trilogy and Burnout Paradise. The Super Nintendo game would arrive in late 1993. It takes place after the events of the first film. The game makes great use of the Mode 7 graphics chip for the virtual reality simulations, as featured in the film. They handle well and scroll smoothly. The platform sections have you control Angelo and Carla for a 2-player option. You shoot and jump around the levels in a standard platformer, picking up different power-ups for your gun and gaining the outfit used for the VR simulation as body armor. The platforming levels at first glance look pretty basic with their design, but everything controls well and runs at a high frame rate. The SNES version did receive favourable reviews at the time, with Superplay awarding it 77%, CVG 88%, and it was even covered on the Games Master TV show, with it being awarded 86%. The game would also arrive on the Sega Mega Drive a year later, and published by Time Warner, and it was sadly a clumsy port that played slower. The sprite of Pierce Brosnan was changed for some reason, the music sounded garbled and messy, and the VR sections didn't play as well, looking less polished than the SNES counterpart. The scores were kind of the same with the multi-format dedicated magazines, giving it slightly less positive reviews compared to the SNES original. The Game Boy game would essentially be a scaled-back version of the SNES and Mega Drive version. It plays very much the same, and they even attempt the VR levels, and do a pretty good job of it considering the hardware, and it reviewed well, with CVG awarding it 87%. The game would also hit the Sega CD and PC CD-ROM. It was a full motion video style game, so press left and right when prompted like Dragon's Lair and Road Avenger, and there were some mini puzzles to complete, and good lord it's awful. Horrendously slow, you get one life, and if you make a mistake you have to watch a long-winded cutscene of being cut up by a lawnmower that goes on for ages. If you want to punish yourself and try and complete it, it will take about 30 minutes or so if you don't mess it up. It may have looked impressive in photos in magazines, but in action it's a different story. The magazines were pretty kind to the PC port, with CVG awarding it 88%, the buffoons, and Mean Machine Sega gave it what it deserved with 46%, saying, "It does look nice, but sadly it plays like a brick." And any goodwill for this movie has gone with this game. Now, this wasn't the end of crappy FMV games based on the Lawnmower Man. One would arrive on PC and Mac in 1994, and in 1995 for the PlayStation, but only in Japan, called Cyber War. Interestingly, the film was known as Virtual Wars in Japan. Again, like the previous game on CD-ROM, it was a sequel and yet again limited on proper gameplay. Thankfully, these types of games would die out, as gamers knew there wasn't much to them, as the novelty of FMV wore thin by the mid-90s. Gamers were now desperate for anything in 3D, with the next generation of consoles on the horizon, such as the Sony PlayStation and the Sega Saturn. Due to the success of The Lawnmower Man, especially on VHS, New Line Cinema wanted a sequel, which was announced in February of 1993. Pierce Brosnan was on board, which was reported in the LA Times, but decided not to, as he was cast as James Bond. Jeff Fahey had moved on, and Brett Leonard went off to make Virtuosity, so they scrapped their plans and started from scratch. They created a new character called Dr. Benjamin Trace, played by Patrick Bergin. The director Farhad Mann, who had worked on Max Headroom, brought on Max Headroom himself, Matt Frewer, to play Job, with only Austin O'Brien returning from the original cast. The plot centres around the founder of virtual reality, Dr. Trace, who has lost a legal battle to secure a patent on the most powerful worldwide communications chip ever invented, called the Chiron chip. If the chip fell into the wrong hands, he has the potential to dominate a society dependent on computers. Corporate tycoon Jonathan Walker takes over the development of the chip, and he and his team discover Job, who is barely alive after the destruction of VSI. This kind of makes no sense, but never mind. They reconstruct Job, and they hook him up to their database to have him help perfect the chip. Oh my god, that looks so bad. 6 years later, we meet Peter, who is a computer hacker, living in the subways of a cyberpunk Los Angeles, i.e. the world of Blade Runner, with a group of other runaway teens. While hooked up into cyberspace, Job reconnects with Peter and asks him to find Dr. Trace for him. Peter locates Trace living in a desert and brings him to his hideout to speak with Job. Job shows Trace his newly constructed cyber world and asks him about the Egypt link, a hidden nanoroutine in the Chiron chip's design. Trace refuses to tell him, noting that Job is insane and would not understand its power. Enraged, Matt Frewer goes full Jim Carrey with his performance and begins causing havoc in an attempt to destroy the world so that everyone will join and follow him as a virtual messiah. I first heard about the sequel when Dominic Diamond visited the set for an episode of Games Master. Because VR was part of that gaming culture, it seemed natural to cover the movie. Once it hit cinemas, it was considered one of the worst sequels ever made. I saw it once and vowed to never again. I'd rather watch Highlander 2 or Mortal Kombat Annihilation, that's for sure. It's baffling why they even bothered to make it, expecting the audience to believe Matt Frewer was Job, as he gives us a completely different performance. The visual effects for the VR have certainly improved. A lot has changed in the past couple of years with CGI, but every time they go into VR, the actors are just clumsily hanging from wires. It's quite laughable. Where is Christopher Reeve when you need him? The script is just appalling, with loads of terrible techno waffle that makes no sense, and even the actors seem confused when they spout it. It's like it's been put together by someone who has no idea how a computer works. The only saving grace about this movie is the score by Robert Folk, who goes full on bombastic with the music, vastly superior to Dan Wyman's limp music for the first film. Folk's score is incredible, but it's lumped with a terrible film. It was savaged by the critics back in 1996, and only made just over $2 million at the US box office on a budget of $15 million. It has a rating of 2.6 out of 10 on IMDb, and is on the list of the worst movies ever made. So yeah, best avoided. I first saw The Lawnmower Man back on VHS in 1993 when it came out to rent. There had been a lot of talk about VR on the various tech-related programs like Tomorrow's World. There was Cyberzone, hosted by Craig Charles of Red Dwarf, that let contestants take part in the virtual world, and the use of virtual reality was a hot topic at the time. Being an avid gamer, this seemed like the future. Me and my friends were pretty eager to try it out, though once you got the chance, you instantly knew there was a problem. It was slow, it had poor frame rates, the 3D graphics didn't impress compared to what you saw in The Lawnmower Man, and after using it for a while, you ended up with a bit of a headache. The future of VR ran out of steam, as many lost interest as the technology just wasn't there yet to make it affordable, usable, and to avoid those teething problems of giving people headaches. Of course, in the last number of years, VR has come back and is far better than what people experienced in the 90s. Despite a big push, it hasn't really become mainstream, but you can go out there and buy the headsets and use it for your PlayStation, PC or Mac. So going into the film, I knew it was based on a Stephen King story, which I hadn't read or heard of, though I would later find out it had nothing to do with the original source material. But I didn't really care at the time. Firstly, the VR sequences were pretty impressive. The use of the technology and how you interacted with it made sense. The VR goggles resembled the headsets that we use now, unlike the VR machines you saw in the arcades, which looked like it would break your neck. As highlighted earlier, the visual effects don't hold up that well today. They look dated and often laughable, but as a kid they were pretty cool to see, and it was the main selling point, and having someone go into the computer world was very interesting to me. It was just like Tron, and I like Tron. I've gone back to the movie a few times over the years. It's never going to top the list of my favourite movies, but there is something about it that has always intrigued me. I think the core premise of using technology to improve someone's intelligence through the use of additional drug enhancements creates an interesting foundation, as we see Job get smarter quickly and begins to take revenge on those who hurt or insulted him with his telekinesis powers as he transforms into a superhuman. It has all the trappings of a comic book. As we know Job is a fan of Cybo Man, it all gels together pretty well with its foreshadowing as he essentially becomes Cybo Man. Jeff Fahey provides a really sympathetic performance and ends up becoming the villain. Even though he has attacked people and punishes Angelo as he attempts to stop his progress, you still feel a sense of sadness for him. Jeff is very good with acting with just his eyes, as you see the pain he is in, as you know the troubles he has gone through. It's quite a unique character arc you don't tend to see that much. Someone who has the mind of a child but is self-aware of their own problems, but is unwilling to stand up for themselves, becoming this all-powerful superhuman that loses his sense of humanity to gain as much power as possible, as the Project 5 drug makes him psychotic. It's quite a sad tale, but he does retain some empathy in the digital world as he fears having Peter die at VSI as it begins to explode, as he was his only friend. Pierce Brosnan, who had no interest in computers and all the technology surrounding him, creates a very convincing performance to make us believe he knows what he is talking about. Having Pierce involved along with Jeff helps shift it away from being somewhat of a cheap B movie. They do give the movie some credibility. Brett does have a great cast at his disposal, and if it was under someone else's direction who perhaps wasn't that familiar with VR and was taking the role as a director as just a job, I think it would have fallen into a hilarious clunky sci-fi film and uninformed with the technology it makes use of, very much like the sequel. Stephen King has had his name attached to a number of bad adaptations of his work, and in the case of The Lawnmower Man, yeah, it takes huge liberties. It only features one scene in reference to his story, but the film's visual style and themes don't seem at all alien to what King writes about. People have made comparisons to Firestarter with The Shop, which is King's secret government agency that pops up in Tommyknockers and The Stand, to name just a few, and it's also in The Lawnmower Man. So Brett and his writing partner Jamil were very much tapping into King's other work to flesh out the script. I think trying to make the original short story into a feature was a difficult task anyway. There isn't much to it. We have seen short stories or basic ideas being expanded into a feature film with mixed results, but even if they had stayed faithful to King's work, they still would have had to throw in new ideas. This may have pleased or displeased King at the time, who knows? I do understand King's frustration, but I do think there was a bit of an overreaction at the time. The Lawnmower Man has its flaws, of course, as Job going into the VR world doesn't make any sense, it doesn't have much logic to it, but it's a fun idea nonetheless, and for me it's fine just to go along with it. With the theatrical cut, despite feeling less developed with its story, it whips along and gets to those bigger moments quickly, resulting in a better pace. As the movie doesn't really have much action and relies on the VR sequences to provide some visual excitement, in both cuts it can feel a bit pedestrian, more so in the director's cut. Once Job's demeanour changes after accidentally lobotomizing his girlfriend, his voice shifts in tone, and this is where it begins to get exciting and taps into the horror elements, which is nearly an hour into the movie, and nearly 90 minutes into the director's cut, so some may find it does take its time to get into full gear. Once he starts punishing people, for example with Jake who runs the gas station, it's not particularly interesting how he gets killed, though Job's introduction is brilliantly shot with the lighting and when his suit begins to glow. Jake gets tied up in a petrol pump cable, and Job enters his mind and chews up his brain. He should have blown up the place. As we see Job continue to take revenge, it has to revolve around using the computer graphics to visualize what he does. Killing the priest should have utilized real fire, not a CG effect, because he's using his mind now. If he's controlling things like squeezing out toothpaste and moving furniture, then it should be a practical effect once he attacks. I think that would have made it more exciting to watch to strengthen the horror vibes. The final confrontation in the VR world is where it's supposed to be the most exciting part of the movie, but the over-reliance on the limited computer effects results in a very disappointing sequence. The animation on Job is comical, and it got chuckles from me when I first saw it, which is not what the filmmakers intended. The film had to have this sequence, but it's difficult to think of what else they could have done. I suppose Job in his digital form should have been redesigned. They should have had a mask to hide his mouth to avoid trying to animate the speech, which is the worst part of the CG. The Lawnmower Man is a product of its time. There are ideas in this that are very dated. Job finds himself trapped in a computer system that probably has the same processing power of a Philips CDI. There's no foresight about the internet. I suppose virtual reality is the equivalent, as Job tells Dr. Angelo it's another world where everyone by 2001 would be connected, and he intends to use it to cleanse the earth, as he suffers from this god complex. It's like many other movies before the internet was a thing. They have this idea how we would experience and use computers in the coming years, and it all seems now quite naive, but you can't future-proof these type of movies, as most get the future wrong. I'm still waiting for those flying cars from Blade Runner and Back to the Future Part 2. The Lawnmower Man, despite all that, still has an interesting premise at its core, being a cautionary tale about the abuse of new technology, and it still stands up in that regard. Brosnan and Fahey both provide great performances. For its limited budget, they managed to achieve a lot. Sure, it's cheesy and dated, but you have to bear in mind it's over 30 years old. It's not a masterpiece, and I think it reviewed fairly at the time, and many people just see it as an average sci-fi film, which is fine. Others may hate it because it has nothing to do with King's original short story, which I'm not going to argue against. To me, the film is just pure nostalgia. It came out at the right time when the VR craze was happening, and it all seemed really exciting, and The Lawnmower Man helped provide a window into our imaginations of what future tech may be like. It may have not been entirely correct, but it was a fun experiment nonetheless. I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to click the like button and hit the bell to be notified of my latest reviews. Big thanks to my patrons and YouTube members for supporting the channel. If you want to get involved and gain access to exclusive videos and take part in Q&As, follow the link below.